Good evening, time travelers. Before we dive together into the depths of the Middle Ages, let me invite you to a little ritual. If you enjoy this kind of story, if this journey into the past soothes you, entertains you, or simply sparks your curiosity, then I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It will help our little community of dreamers and curious minds grow. And tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you? Is it late, your eyelids growing heavy? Or maybe it's the middle of the day, a quiet pause amidst the modern hustle. I am always amazed that these stories travel not just across time, but now across borders as well. Now, get comfortable. Let the modern comforts wrap around you. A soft pillow, gentle lighting, maybe a warm blanket. Breathe deeply, because what I'm about to tell you tonight isn't fiction. It's a true story, yet so strange it could feel like a fairy tale. Imagine opening your eyes inside a little cottage in the 13th century. The floor is packed dirt, uneven, sometimes covered with straw. You're lying on a pile of damp hay, covered with a rough blanket. It scratches, it itches, and it's crawling with tiny insects. Fleas jump on your arms, leaving little red bites that already sting your skin. You sit up, and the room is freezing. No central heating, no glass windows, just small holes, letting in damp air and the strong smell of wood smoke. With each deep breath, another scent comes forward. A mix of urine, sweat, wet earth, and excrement. That's everyday life. For a modern traveler, it would be unbearable within minutes. But for a medieval villager, it was normal. Want to wash your face? You instinctively look for a faucet. But there isn't one. Water must be fetched, sometimes from far away. In the countryside, people made multiple trips a day to the well. In winter, they had to break the ice. In spring, they trudged through thick mud. Once drawn, the water wasn't clear like bottled water today. It was murky, full of dirt, insects, sometimes even the bodies of animals that had fallen in. Yet it served every purpose: drinking, cooking, washing, and watering the animals. Doctors of the time knew water could be dangerous. In some 14th century Parisian chronicles, there are entire complaints about dysentery outbreaks caused by contaminated wells. But most people had no choice. Public baths did exist, remnants from the Roman Empire. In the cities, you would enter naked and immerse yourself in large, heated wooden tubs. These were as much social spaces as places for hygiene. People would talk, eat, and relax there. Over time, the church grew suspicious. Too much closeness, too much temptation. Some priests condemned baths as places of lust. They claimed water opened the body to sin and let disease in. So the baths were closed. In Paris, many were forbidden by the 15th century. The wealthy turned to perfumes, ointments, and aromatic powders. But that was camouflage, not real hygiene. The poor bathed very rarely, maybe once or twice a year during major religious festivals or before a wedding. Imagine wearing the same shirt for months, sleeping in it, working in it, sweating in it. Result? Clothes crawling with lice, fleas, and ticks. Medieval chronicles even speak of living shirts because the parasites were so pervasive. Changing your clothes was a luxury. Washing them? Even more so. People beat the garments in the river, stretched them on stones, but it damaged the fabric and took time. Most simply wore the same clothes until they wore out completely. to reduce infestations, many shaved their heads, not for fashion, but to avoid lice. This is where some head coverings and hats originated. And your teeth? No toothbrush, no toothpaste. Sometimes people chewed hazel branches or herbs like sage, but it was rudimentary at best. Result? Cavities, abscesses, bleeding gums. When a tooth hurt too much, it was pulled with forceps, no anesthesia, screaming all around. Some taverns even offered this improvised service. A barber would pull a customer's tooth right on a bench, in front of everyone. A spectacle, more than a treatment. And then there were bodily needs. No modern toilets. In the countryside, people went behind a tree or used a bucket they later emptied into a pit. In cities, waste was thrown out the window. Someone would shout, "Watch out for the water," as chamber pot contents spilled onto the passers-by. Streets became filthy. In 14th century Paris, an Italian traveler described sidewalks so slippery with filth, you'd lose your shoe with every step. Animals added to the chaos. Pigs, dogs, horses leaving their droppings everywhere. Some cities tried regulations. In London, ordinances forbade throwing waste in front of your house. But without modern sewers, everything stagnated. And amidst this scene, rats thrived. Drawn to the filth, they infiltrated homes, carrying fleas infected with the plague. But the medieval people didn't know this. They blamed the air, odors, cats, even foreigners. The result? Thousands of cats were killed, and rats multiplied even more. Plague doctors, recognizable by their beak-like masks, filled them with aromatic herbs, believing they would filter the miasma. But nothing worked. The air remained heavy, and every breath carried risk. Try to imagine it. You wake up, covered in fleas. You step outside, and the first thing you notice is the smell of waste. Your clothes are infested. Your water is cloudy. Your meal is served in dishes rarely cleaned. The streets are slick with mud and waste. Animals share your home, living alongside you. And yet, people laughed, sang, went to the tavern. They survived simply because they had no choice. For you, accustomed to hot showers and perfumes, this world would be a constant assault on the senses. You wouldn't last 5 minutes. And yet, they lived their entire lives this way. Imagine that. You have a fever. You tremble. Your teeth chatter. You sweat. Today, you would see a doctor. You'd get a prescription, antibiotics, a comfortable bed. In the Middle Ages, no. Medicine was a mix of ancient science, religious faith, folk traditions, and a lot of luck. The foundation of medieval medicine, inherited from the Greeks, was the theory of the 4 humors. Your health depended on the balance between blood, associated with warmth and moisture, yellow bile, warm and dry, black bile, cold and dry, and phlegm, cold and moist. If you fell ill, it was believed that one of these humors dominated. Feeling melancholic? Too much black bile. Feverish? Excess blood. Healing meant restoring balance, often by removing something from the body. The most common treatment was bloodletting. A vein would be opened in your arm, foot, or even forehead to purge the illness. Some doctors used leeches, others small scalpels. Prescriptions were precise, 1/4 of a liter, sometimes more. But texts show excesses. A patient already weak could die, drained of blood more than from their disease. Bloodletting wasn't just for the sick. It was also preventive. Some nobles had it done several times a year, convinced it maintained their health. Timing was even chosen according to the stars. Manuals detailed the best days to open a vein based on the moon or planets. Medicine and astrology were intertwined. If your problem was more serious, you visited the barber surgeon. This was the person who pulled teeth, applied cupping, set fractures, and even amputated limbs. His sign? A pole with red and white stripes, recalling blood-stained cloths hanging outside his shop. That image has stuck with us. It's the origin of the modern barber. Imagine an amputation. No anesthesia, no sterilization. Two men held the screaming patient while the barber cut with a fire-heated knife. The wound was cauterized with a red-hot iron. Sometimes the patient fainted. Sometimes died of shock. If they survived, it was pure luck. Infection was almost guaranteed. Some methods seem unbelievable today. Trepanation, for example. They drilled a hole into the skull to release demons or relieve pressure from an injury. Surprisingly, some skulls found by archaeologists show signs of healing. A few patients survived. Mental or neurological illnesses, like epilepsy, were seen as possessions. The treatment was exorcism. Crosses were placed on the patient, prayers were recited, holy water sprinkled. Hospitals existed, but they weren't places of healing as we know them. They were religious institutions run by the church. They housed the poor, pilgrims, orphans, and the incurably ill. In Paris, the Hôtel Dieu could hold over 1,000 patients, crammed into huge dormitories. No separation, no hygiene, no disinfection. Contagion spread like wildfire, but they provided a bed, a meal, prayers. For many, it was a place to die surrounded by others, rather than a place to heal. One of the most feared diseases was leprosy. It deformed the face, ate away at limbs, caused blindness. Lepers were excluded from society, sent to leprosariums, small isolated communities. Some rituals included a symbolic funeral. The leper was considered dead to the world of the living. They were given a cloak and a bell to signal their passage, living apart from everyone else. Alongside learned medicine, there were folk remedies. Wise women used plants, sage, thyme, mugwort, valerian. They applied mud poultices, brewed root decoctions. Some remedies seem bizarre today. Drinking wine in which a heated iron had been soaked to strengthen the blood, eating black bread mixed with powdered horn, or wearing an amulet containing a snippet of scripture sewn into clothing. Sometimes these practices worked by accident. Willow bark, used in an infusion for fevers, contained salicin, the ancestor of aspirin. But no one knew it. The difference between rich and poor was enormous. A lord could hire a university-trained doctor, familiar with Latin texts, prescribing diets, perfumed baths, spiced elixirs. A peasant had to rely on a local healer, a prayer, or sheer luck. The rich drank costly potions, sometimes more dangerous than helpful. The poor drank stagnant water and prayed. Medieval medicine was especially tested by great epidemics. The Black Death of 1347 to 1352 wiped out between a third and half of Europe's population. Doctors, powerless, wore their beak masks, filled with aromatic herbs to filter the miasma. They blamed corrupted air, misaligned planets, or worse, minorities like the Jews, victims of pogroms. Processions of flagellants were organized, entire crowds whipping their own backs to atone for sins. But nothing stopped the disease. Being sick in the Middle Ages was like entering a cruel lottery. Treatments could relieve or kill faster. Hospitals offered spiritual comfort, but rarely healing. Healers knew effective plants, but risked being accused of witchcraft. And yet, some survived, by miracle, by sheer toughness, or by luck. Medieval medicine, a mix of science, faith, and magic, offered little reassurance. For you, used to antibiotics, vaccines, and modern hospitals, this world would seem terrifying. You wouldn't survive a single illness. You wake up with an empty stomach, no fridge, no cupboard stocked with snacks, no steaming cup of coffee waiting for you. In the Middle Ages, eating was never guaranteed. Every meal was a battle against hunger, a question of survival. And what ended up on your plate depended entirely on your social rank, the season, and your luck. Bread was the mainstay, sometimes making up more than half of a person's daily calories. But it wasn't the crusty baguette you might imagine. The bread of the poor was dark, heavy, made from rye or barley. Sometimes it contained seeds, bark, even mill dust. And beware, if the rye was infected with ergot, a type of fungus, it caused hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene. People called it St. Anthony's fire. Whole villages could be struck, people seeing visions, losing limbs, dying in terrible agony. For the rich, bread was white, made from fine wheat. At noble tables, it was even used as a plate, thick slices called trencher bread, on which meat was served. After the meal, soaked pieces, rich with juices and fat, were given to dogs or the poor. The second pillar of the diet was soup, a large cauldron on the fire into which everything available was thrown: cabbage, turnips, leeks, sometimes legumes like beans or peas. Meat was rare. The cooking water was often reused for days. Ingredients were added, mixed, stretched. This broth was the peasant's daily meal, eaten morning and night. Sometimes it was so thin, it was more like hot water than a meal. For a peasant, meat was exceptional. A piece of salted pork shared among the family, or a chicken slaughtered for a big occasion. The nobles, however, ate meat in abundance: beef, pork, venison, wild boar. At their banquets, they served spectacular dishes: roast peacock, swan, heron. Chroniclers even report that some animals were decorated with edible gold leaf. But this abundance hid a problem. Meat wasn't always fresh. It was preserved by salting, smoking, or drying, making it tough, very salty, sometimes rancid. Spices, extremely expensive, served as much to show off wealth as to mask taste. Dairy products were essential: hard cheese that lasted, long curdled milk, butter in some regions. Eggs were eaten, but remained precious. Fish was indispensable, largely because of religious rules. The church required more than 150 days of abstinence from meat per year, sometimes up to 200 depending on the region. So people ate fish: herring, cod, carp. But again, preservation was a challenge. Salted herring, imported from the North Sea, was so hard it sometimes had to be broken with an axe before soaking. Fresh fruit was seasonal: apples, pears, plums. Off-season, there was no miracle. Fruits were dried or turned into preserves, if you could afford it. Sugar was rare and expensive, considered a spice, and sold in apothecaries. The nobles indulged in sugar, often in the form of dragées. For the common folk, sweetness came mainly from honey. Water was often contaminated, so people drank mainly wine or beer. Not the refined wine you might imagine. It was sour, often watered down. The rich drank spiced wines, claret scented with cinnamon or ginger. The peasants drank ale, a cloudy, low-alcohol beer without hops. They drank it from morning, including children, better than germ-filled water. Eating in the Middle Ages also meant enduring famine. A poor harvest or a war could lead to catastrophe. Chronicles from the 14th century recount entire years of scarcity. People ate roots, herbs, even tree bark. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, some accounts mention bread made from acorn flour. Others even speak of cases of cannibalism. Grain prices soared, and the poorest died by the thousands. Meanwhile, castles echoed with endless banquets. Dozens of dishes were served on long tables covered with cloths. Minstrels played, jugglers entertained. An English chronicler recounts a royal banquet where a whole boar was served, stuffed with partridges, themselves stuffed with quail. Food became a spectacle, but behind this abundance lay another reality. The nobles often suffered from gout, obesity, or kidney stones. Abundant food did not always mean health. In the Middle Ages, diet revealed social inequalities more than anything. For the poor, every meal was survival. For the rich, every meal was a sign of power. And sometimes the two worlds collided. The scraps from noble tables, soaked with fat and sauce, were given to beggars waiting outside the castle gates. In short, eating in the Middle Ages meant living with uncertainty. One day, you could be feasting at the tavern over a steaming bowl of soup one day, and the next, you might have only a crust of moldy bread to share. For you, used to supermarkets open 7 days a week, that kind of diet would be unbearable. You wouldn't last a week. Imagine living in a small medieval village. Life is harsh, social rules are strict. But what happens if someone steals, fights, or worse, commits murder? Today, you'd think of a courtroom, a judge, a lawyer. In the Middle Ages, justice was nothing like that. It was brutal, theatrical, sometimes absurd. One of the strangest practices was the ordeal, or the judgment of God. People believed that God would not let an innocent person suffer unfairly. To prove your innocence, you had to pass a test. It might mean plunging your hand into boiling water to retrieve a ring. The wound would then be examined. If it healed quickly, you were innocent. Another test involved walking barefoot across hot coals or being thrown, bound, into a river. If you floated, it meant the pure waters of God rejected you, so you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent, but often too late. These tests may seem absurd today, but they were considered just. Many feared them more than death itself. Another method was the duel. Two opponents would fight, sometimes to the death, to settle a dispute. A neighbor accuses you of stealing his field? You could challenge him to a duel. The winner was believed to be protected by God. These fights weren't just for knights. Even peasants could be forced to participate. Weapons could be anything: sticks, shields, or improvised tools. Women took part too. A famous German engraving shows a judicial duel between a man and a woman. He stood in a hole up to his waist, armed with a club, while she circled him, swinging a sack of stones. Crimes didn't always lead to death. Many were punished publicly. The pillory, for example, was a cage or a board with holes for the head and hands. The condemned would be displayed in the town square, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Passers-by mocked them, threw rotten vegetables, stones, even foul water. An adulterous woman could be paraded through town with a shaved head. A thief might be branded with a hot iron. In some cases, ridiculous clothing was used to humiliate the guilty. The idea was clear: punish, but above all, make an example. For serious crimes, the punishment was severe. Hanging was the most common method. Gallows were erected on the outskirts of towns, visible from afar. Bodies remained suspended for days, sometimes weeks, as a warning. Beheadings were reserved for nobles. Considered a more honorable death, they required a skilled executioner. In some accounts, an unskilled executioner had to try multiple blows. Burning at the stake was reserved for heretics and witches. Flames consumed the body before the eyes of the crowd. Prayers were recited, psalms sung, and spectators would leave speaking of divine justice. Of course, courts existed too. Lords administered justice on their lands. Bishops and abbots judged religious matters. In Paris, the Parliament, established in the 13th century, began centralizing royal justice. But for ordinary people, fate often decided their fate. A lenient lord, a corrupt judge, an influential neighbor. And torture was part of the process. To extract a confession, an accused might be stretched on the rack, have their fingers broken, or crushed under weights. A confession, even wrung from pain, counted as proof. And here's one of the strangest parts: trials of animals. Yes, in the Middle Ages, pigs, rats, and dogs could be put on trial. A pig that killed a child could be sentenced to death, hanged, or burned in public. Rats accused of destroying wheat fields could receive an official summons. A lawyer might even plead on their behalf, arguing they couldn't appear because the roads were too dangerous due to cats. These trials seem absurd today, but they were taken very seriously. They reflected a world where the laws of man and God applied to all creatures. Medieval justice was more than an institution. It was a spectacle. Every trial, every punishment, every execution was public. The aim was to frighten, humiliate, instruct. People came to see hangings, much like we go to the movies today. Children climbed on their father's shoulders to get a better view of the rope tightening. A 15th century chronicler from Rouen wrote, "The crowd presses together as if for a fair, each shouting, laughing, or crying according to their mood." Imagine living in that world. At any moment, you could be accused. One wrong word, one quarrel, and it's the pillory. Steal a loaf of bread, and you could lose a hand. Rumors of heresy could lead you to the stake. For you, used to written laws and impartial judges, medieval justice would seem monstrous, unfair, arbitrary, and terrifying. Imagine a medieval child. No colorful toys, no backpacks stuffed with notebooks, no rooms decorated with posters. Childhood wasn't a protected bubble. It was fragile, short, often brutally interrupted. Birth itself was a challenge, a fragile life from the first breath. There were no hospitals, no specialized doctors. Mothers gave birth at home, helped by a midwife, an experienced woman from the village. Clean sheets if you had them, a bit of wine to wash the newborn, sometimes fragrant herbs to ward off miasmas. But danger was everywhere. Hemorrhage, infection, a breech baby, all could kill the mother. In some regions, 1 in 3 women didn't survive childbirth. The child had little better odds. Infant mortality was terrifying. Up to 1/3 of babies died before age 5. That's why they baptized children as quickly as possible, sometimes the same day they were born, not out of joy, but out of fear that the baby might die without the sacraments. Often, the child is given the name of a saint, or the name of a brother or sister who died young, as if to ward off death. There's no modern crib. The baby sleeps in a chest made for the purpose, or in the family bed. They are nursed at the breast, sometimes entrusted to a wet nurse when the mother has to work in the fields. Illness is constant. Diarrhea, fevers, all the things we consider minor today. But back then, they killed thousands of children every year. A harsh winter could wipe out an entire generation of infants. And yet, children played. Archaeological digs have revealed wooden spinning tops, rag dolls, jacks, clay marbles. They imitated adults. Boys played at war with sticks, girls at marriage or cooking. Medieval monks often complained about the noise. Children in the cloisters disturbed the psalms with their laughter and games. By age 5 or 6, a child was already useful. In the countryside, they tended geese, gathered firewood, helped sow or harvest. The younger ones watched babies, cared for chickens, carried water. In the towns, children became apprentices. Contracts were signed. A boy of 8 or 10 could enter a baker's, blacksmith's, or weaver's shop. The apprenticeship lasted 7, 10, sometimes 12 years. The master housed the child, fed them, taught them, but demanded total obedience. Beatings were frequent. Days were long. Most peasant children couldn't read or write. Even some nobles signed with a simple cross. But in towns and monasteries, a few schools began opening in the 12th century. Boys learned to read, write, count, recite Latin. Girls were rarely admitted. Their education was limited to sewing, spinning, and running a household. Exceptions existed. Some nuns, like Hildegard of Bingen, became scholars, doctors, authors. For noble boys, education took a different shape. Around 7, they became pages in a castle, then squires at 14, and finally knights around 21. Their childhood was military preparation. Childhood ended early. A girl could be married as young as 12 or 13. A boy around 14 or 15. These marriages were rarely love stories. They were family alliances. A young girl could find herself wed to a man in his 40s. She was expected to bear heirs, manage the household, obey. A 14th century chronicler tells of an 11-year-old girl married to a 60-year-old noble. For families, it was a contract. For the child, a brutal rupture. War spared no one. When a village was attacked, children fled into the woods, hid under beds, or were taken hostage. Some were forcibly enlisted as pages or young servants in armies. In 1212, the famous Children's Crusade saw thousands of young people, convinced they could liberate Jerusalem, set out towards the Mediterranean. Many died of hunger and disease. Others were sold as slaves. This tragedy marked the Chronicles, proof of both the fragility and the manipulation of children. Famines hit the youngest hardest. Their fragile bodies struggled to survive. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, thousands of children died in the streets. Some were abandoned by parents who could not feed them. Medieval cemeteries reveal the harsh reality, a staggering number of tiny, often anonymous graves. You might think medieval parents were detached because so many children died young. But sources show otherwise. Letters, songs, and poems express the pain of losing a child. Christine de Pizan wrote, "The loss of a child pierces the heart like 1,000 spears. Parents loved their children, laughed with them, rocked them with lullabies, mourned their loss. Yet they had to keep living, because the survival of the family depended on the living. A 12-year-old could be judged as an adult. A teen accused of theft could be whipped, placed in the pillory, even hanged. Judicial records are full of cases where children were condemned, proof that the concept of childhood as a protected age barely existed. So imagine this: being born into the fear of dying before 5, working from age 6, married at 12, judged as an adult at 14, sent to war before even knowing what life really was. Medieval childhood was not a bubble. It was fleeting, fragile, often brutal. And yet, despite it all, children laughed, sang, and played. They chased chickens, amused themselves with sticks, told stories by the fire. Drawings left by children in the margins of medieval manuscripts show awkward little figures, funny animals. Even in such a harsh world, innocence found a way. For us, used to schools, birthdays, toys, and social protections, medieval childhood seems unimaginable. Plunged into that world, you wouldn't survive a single year as a medieval child. Now imagine being a woman in the Middle Ages. No right to vote, no choice in marriage, no freedom to decide your own life. Your existence is defined by your birth, your marriage, your ability to have children. And yet, behind this apparent submission, medieval women played an immense, vital role, often invisible to the world around them. Most women lived in the countryside. They rose before dawn, fed the animals, gathered firewood, fetched water from wells sometimes miles away. Then they worked the fields, sowing, weeding, harvesting. Their hands grew calloused, their backs bent by the age of 30. But their work didn't stop there. They spun wool, wove coarse cloth, baked bread, tended the fire, and raised the children. They were literally the pillars of rural life. Yet, they received little recognition. Their names rarely appeared in official records. Their voices carried little weight in court. Without them, no village could survive. In towns and markets, women were active participants in the economy. Some ran market stalls, selling vegetables, milk, and cheese. Others worked as seamstresses, bakers, or tavern keepers. Widows sometimes took over their deceased husbands' workshops. In 14th century Paris, records show women running cobbler, brewer, and dyer shops. But their roles were precarious. They often depended on guilds, which limited women's access to trades. Being born noble didn't mean freedom. From childhood, a noble girl was groomed to become a proper wife. She learned to sew, embroider, manage servants, and sometimes read to handle accounts. But her future was set. An arranged marriage, often at 12 or 13. She became a pawn in the chess game of alliances. Some were promised to much older men. Their bodies became political currency. Once married, she had to produce heirs, manage the household, and above all, remain faithful. Adultery could mean public humiliation, shaving of the head, or worse. Marriage was primarily a contract. Girls were married to unite families, accumulate lands, and seal alliances. Love had little place. The church regulated everything. No marriage between close cousins, no separation, no divorce. Women were expected to obey their husbands as if they were domestic lords. For peasant women, marriage was also a social obligation. A single woman was suspect. A widow had to remarry quickly to ensure economic survival. The law placed women under the authority of their father, then their husband. Rarely could they own property in their own name. In some cases, a widow could manage the inheritance of her minor children. But that was the exception. Courts were merciless. An adulterous woman could be paraded through the streets with her head shaved. A woman deemed too independent could be accused of witchcraft. Medieval society had little tolerance for women who defied norms. Yet women worked everywhere: fields, markets, workshops. Some became midwives, healers, caretakers. Others quietly entered forbidden trades like medicine or pharmacy, often as assistants to men. Some even managed large estates, especially when their husbands were away on crusade or at war. They administered lands, collected taxes, and enforced local justice. If female education was rare, it did exist. In convents, some nuns received instruction. They read, copied manuscripts, composed hymns. Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century was an abbess, composer, visionary, and physician. Her writings on plants and healing influenced generations. Christine de Pizan in the 15th century earned a living writing, becoming Europe's first professional female writer. In the Book of the City of Ladies, she argued that women deserved education and recognition. In villages, women held precious knowledge of medicinal plants. They treated fevers with sage, eased pain with valerian, assisted in childbirth. But this knowledge also inspired fear. Too much success, and a woman could be suspected of witchcraft. By the 15th century, trials multiplied. Women accused of pacts with the devil, burned alive simply for practicing their skills. Some women avoided marriage by entering religious orders. Convents offered a space for learning, community, and sometimes power. Abbesses managed lands, directed dozens of nuns, corresponded with kings and popes. But life was austere. Silence, prayer, fasting, strict rules. For some, it was a voluntary prison. For others, an escape. Despite limits, some women left their mark on history. Joan of Arc, a simple peasant girl, led an army and crowned a king. She was burned in the end, yet remained a symbol. Eleanor of Aquitaine ruled a vast duchy, participated in crusades, influenced 2 kingdoms. Queens like Blanche of Castile acted as regents, standing up to rebellious barons. These examples were rare, but they show that even under the shadow of laws, some women managed to shape their world. Being a woman in the Middle Ages meant living constantly under watch. First your father, then your husband, sometimes the church. Few rights, few freedoms, a life defined by others. Yet without them, nothing would have worked. They fed, raised, managed, and healed. They were invisible, but essential. To us, modern people used to equality, rights, and freedoms. This condition seems unbearable. Plunged into that world, you couldn't survive a single lifetime as a medieval woman. Close your eyes. Imagine yourself in the heart of a medieval village on a winter evening. No electricity, just the flickering glow of torches. The wind whistles through the beams, and an owl hoots somewhere in the distance. Every sound in the shadows is a signal. Every gust of wind is a warning. In the Middle Ages, life was steeped in beliefs and superstitions. They explained the unexplainable, sometimes reassured, often terrified. The medieval mind lived in a world where the visible and invisible blended. Fields, forests, and rivers were thought to be inhabited by mysterious forces. A mill that creaks too loudly? Maybe the devil is hiding inside. A spring that never runs dry? Surely a gift from the fairies. Local chronicles are full of stories, ghosts appearing in graveyards, headless monks wandering cloisters, ghostly nights on night roads. And the line between story and reality was so thin, it often disappeared entirely. The church oversaw all these beliefs. It spoke of angels, demons, and protective saints. Every village had its patron saint, meant to ward off disease or protect against fire. Candles were lit, processions held, and crops blessed in the spring. But religion didn't erase superstition. It mixed with it. People prayed to St. Christopher before a journey, but they also hung a rabbit's foot on the cart for extra safety. And above all, the church fed fear. Sermons described hell, cackling demons, and the damned roasting in flames. Cathedral tympanums showed the last judgment, with the condemned dragged by devils. Every faithful person, looking up, saw what awaited them if they sinned. Every action carried meaning. Never place bread upside down. It offends God and brings misfortune. Don't sweep the house after sunset. A crow circling overhead? Death may be near. To protect the home, herbs were hung. Mugwort, saint. John's wort, garlic. Prayers were sewn into children's clothes to ward off nocturnal demons. Even domestic animals were wrapped in belief. A black cat could bring luck or misfortune, depending on the region. Among all superstitions, the fear of witches was the strongest. People believed they gathered at night for Sabbaths, rode broomsticks, and cast spells on cows, crops, or babies. For a long time, these stories were local, almost folkloric. But by the 15th century, they took on a dramatic scope. Major trials began. Women were accused of making pacts with the devil. They were tortured to confess imaginary crimes, stealing milk, causing hail, killing children. They were burned in public squares, under the eyes of a crowd convinced it was a victory of God. These trials were also a way to settle grudges. A jealous neighbor, a dispute, and an accusation of witchcraft could destroy a life. In the face of such fears, everyone protected themselves however they could. Talismans, crosses, relics, and gemstones were believed to ward off disease. Soldiers went to battle with prayers sewn into their armor. Children carried small pouches with salt or animal teeth. Some mixed magic and faith. Prayers written on parchment and worn as amulets. Superstition and religion were inseparable, woven into every aspect of life. Every natural phenomenon was interpreted as a sign. A comet in the sky could mean war, famine, or the death of a king. A solar eclipse was proof the world was nearing its end. In 1348, when the Black Death struck Europe, many believed it was God's punishment for sin. Flagellant processions appeared, entire crowds of men whipping their backs in the streets to atone for sins. Medieval bestiaries were full of creatures, fire-breathing dragons, unicorns as symbols of purity, mermaids luring sailors, basilisks that could kill with a glance. These animals were drawn in manuscripts with a mix of imagination and moral lesson. The unicorn wasn't just a fabulous animal. It embodied chastity. The dragon represented the devil. Each creature was both a life lesson and a supposed real being. Some Crusade chronicles even describe monsters encountered in the East. Dog-headed men, people without mouths. The world was filled with imaginary dangers, taken very seriously. Living in the Middle Ages meant a constant tension between fear and hope. People feared demons, witches, and divine wrath. But they also hoped for the help of saints, the protection of relics, and the comfort of prayer. Each night was a threat, but each morning, the sound of church bells reminded everyone that God was present. This duality shaped life completely. For us, modern folks used to scientific explanations, these beliefs may seem naive or even funny. But for a medieval person, they were vital. They gave meaning to disease, famine, and war. They explained the unexplainable. You, used to horoscopes for fun, reliable weather forecasts, vaccines, and electric lights, wouldn't survive a single night immersed in medieval superstitions. Imagine yourself in a small medieval village. Suddenly, you hear the church bells, but it's not the call to mass. It's an alarm. A troop is approaching. Is it the neighboring lord's army, bandits, or mercenaries on the prowl? You don't have time to find out. You hide whatever you can. You pray the storm passes. Medieval wars weren't the grand campaigns we imagine. They were often local quarrels, a contested field, a toll dispute, an insult at a banquet. And suddenly, a lord raises his troops, attacks his neighbor, and burns their barns. These seemingly trivial conflicts could devastate entire villages. Soldiers didn't just target rival knights. They looted peasants, seized crops, burned houses. The 100 Years' War, the famous clash between France and England from 1337 to 1453, is the best known example. But on a smaller scale, such wars happened everywhere, all the time. For a peasant, war was never a distant event. It was a constant threat. Raids were the nightmare of the countryside. When an army passed through, terror followed. Cattle were stolen, grain stores looted, farming tools smashed, fields were trampled, barns burned. People fled into the woods, leaving everything behind. A Burgundian chronicle recalls, they passed like hail, leaving ashes, orphans, and widows in their wake. Men, in particular, faced violence that official records often ignored, but that the whispers of the people could not. Unlike the knights glorified in epic songs, the life of a medieval soldier was miserable. Days spent marching through mud, nights sleeping outdoors in the rain, eating hard bread and salted lard. Disease killed more than the battles themselves. Dysentery, fevers, famine. They claimed as many lives as swords. Mercenary soldiers called routiers were some of the most feared. They fought for money, and when pay ran out, they took it straight from the villages. These free companies spread terror wherever they went. Battles were rare, but when they happened, they were brutal. Contrary to what we imagine, organized battles were unusual. Lords preferred skirmishes, sieges, and pillaging. When pitched battles occurred, they were brief but unimaginably violent. At Agincourt in 1415, French knights sank into the mud. English archers picked them off from a distance, finishing them off on the ground. Thousands of nobles died, crushed, and suffocated, without ever truly fighting. Weapons added to the horror. Longbows could pierce armor from over 200 meters away. Crossbows were so deadly that the church tried to ban them. Catapults hurled stones, and sometimes diseased corpses, to spread terror in besieged towns. Most conflicts took the form of sieges. Castles or walled towns were surrounded, access cut off, inhabitants starved. The besieged ate horses, then dogs, and sometimes even corpses. Chronicles tell of harrowing scenes where desperate mothers killed their own children to survive. The attackers used trebuchets, battering rams, and tunnels to undermine walls. The inhabitants tried to defend themselves with boiling oil, stones, or even live animals hurled at the assailants. A siege could last months, sometimes years. And when the town fell, it was often a massacre. Survivors were enslaved, homes looted, churches desecrated. Violence ran deep in everyday life too. But war wasn't the only place for brutality. Even in towns and villages, it was part of daily life. Theft could cost a hand. Insult a lord, and you might face the gallows. Executions were public spectacles. Children climbed on adults' shoulders to see the rope tighten. Taverns were constant hotspots for brawls. Knives came out fast, and a fight over dice could end with a body on the floor. Revenge was personal. Justice was slow and often corrupt. So many settled scores themselves. Entire families lived out vendettas spanning generations. People killed over a field, an insult, or a refused marriage. Even nobles engaged in private violence. An offended lord didn't always wait for the king's judgment. He raised his men, attacked, and the law came afterward. In the middle of all this, civilians, especially peasants, paid the heaviest price. They had to feed the armies, pay taxes to fund campaigns, all while watching their crops destroyed by marching troops. Women left alone when the men went to war had to protect their children, hide what little they owned, and face violence themselves. Children grew up in this atmosphere of fear, sometimes playing at being the soldiers who looted their own village. Medieval war wasn't about heroic battles. It was diffuse, constant violence touching every part of life. A rider on the horizon could mean a raid, a burning castle, a coming famine, an angry lord, or a hanging in the public square. For us modern folks, used to governments that protect, laws that limit violence, and organized armies, this world would be unbearable. It wouldn't survive a single year in the life of a medieval peasant, surrounded by war and violence. Imagine a medieval village. In the center, the church, the largest stone building, visible for miles. Around it, small timber and thatch houses seem tiny. The bell tower rings every hour, marking the days, calling people to prayer, announcing births, weddings, and deaths. Religion is everywhere. Life without it is unimaginable. Faith shapes every moment from dawn to dusk. It structures life. You rise at the sound of bells, pray before meals, attend Sunday Mass. Every life stage is blessed. Birth with baptism, coming of age with confirmation, marriage, and then the last rites. Even the days are organized around the liturgical calendar. Lent, Easter, Christmas, Saints' Days. Out of more than 300 days in the year, nearly half are marked by fasting, feasts, or processions. Every Sunday, the priest reminds villagers of the importance of saving their souls. Sermons, delivered in Latin and sometimes translated into the local language, were powerful performances. They described the flames of hell, the torment of the damned, the bliss of the saints. These images struck the mind. Villagers, often illiterate, knew the Bible mainly through these vivid tales. At the heart of medieval religion, there was fear. People believed in a just but merciless God. Every sin, every failing could condemn a soul to eternal damnation. The depictions from that time are terrifying. Illuminated manuscripts show demons with gaping mouths, tympanums carved with the damned being boiled and flayed by sneering devils. The Last Judgment is an obsession. People believe the world could end at any moment, and everyone trembles at the thought of being on the wrong side. The damned, not the chosen. Indulgences and relics offer some comfort. The church develops a complex system. Indulgences, in exchange for donations, pilgrimages, or prayers, one could shorten their time in purgatory. Relics also played a huge role. People venerated fragments of saints' bones, pieces of the cross, or martyrs' garments. Every church wanted a relic, something that could protect the village, heal the sick, and attract pilgrims. At Vézelay, they claimed to have relics of Mary Magdalene. At Compostela, the tomb of St. James drew crowds from across Europe. Pilgrimages were both spiritual and physical journeys. Thousands of faithful walked for weeks, even months, to reach a sanctuary. They slept in barns, begged for food, faced bandits. But they kept going, convinced that every step brought them closer to salvation. The pilgrim symbol, the scallop shell, was worn on hats or cloaks, a mark that said, "I walk for God." Official religion didn't erase old beliefs. In villages, people blessed the fields in spring, hung wooden crosses to protect crops, sprinkled holy water on barns to ward off spirits. Priests might bless an army before battle, a woman in labor, or even a sick pig. The line between faith and superstition was thin. But for medieval people, everything was connected. God, the saints, demons, spirits. Another face of religion was monastic life. In abbeys, monks lived under strict rules: silence, prayer, work. They chanted 8 offices a day, copied manuscripts, and cultivated simple medicinal gardens. Monasteries were also centers of knowledge. Without them, much of ancient culture would have been lost. But their life was austere, marked by fasting and abstinence. The church wasn't only spiritual, it was political. Bishops owned land, collected taxes, commanded armies. The Pope rivaled kings across Europe. Crusades were preached as holy wars. A medieval villager thus lived under 2 authorities, his lord and his priest. Both demanded his obedience, his money, and sometimes even his soul. But what mattered most was the afterlife. Life was short and fragile, often cut down by disease, war, or famine. People thought constantly about what came next. They prayed to shorten their time in purgatory, had masses said for the dead, gave money to the church to save their souls. Death wasn't an end, it was a stage, but for many, a terrifying stage leading to eternal flames. Now imagine your life in that world. Every day marked by the church bells, every action watched by God, every thought scrutinized by angels and demons. A world where the smallest slip could condemn you. For us modern people, used to freedom of conscience, science, and reason, it would be unbearable. You wouldn't survive a single lifetime as a medieval Christian obsessed with salvation and terrified of hell. And there it is. Our journey comes to an end. For over an hour, you've walked with me through the dark, noisy paths of the Middle Ages. You've smelled the filth of crowded streets, shivered in the cold halls of castles, heard bells ring the alarm of an approaching army, and felt the fear of hell in a priest's eyes. We've explored hygiene, or rather, the lack of it, medicine, caught between ancient science and terrifying superstition. Food, black bread, thin soups, and sometimes over-the-top feasts. Justice, brutal. Public, relentless. Childhood cut short. Dragged too soon into work and the dangers of life. Women, trapped in arranged marriages or accused of witchcraft. Beliefs, between saints and demons. Hope and fear. War, omnipresent, devouring the countryside and towns. And finally, religion, an invisible yet powerful framework where every thought was weighed against eternity. All of this may seem distant, foreign, almost unreal. And yet, this world existed. For centuries, millions of men, women, and children lived, loved, suffered, laughed, and prayed under these conditions. They survived where you and I likely wouldn't last 5 minutes. So now, relax your shoulders. Imagine closing the heavy gates of a medieval town behind you. The noises fade, the smells vanish. You slowly return to our world, a world where water flows clear from a tap, light springs from a simple switch, and medicine saves lives every day. Take a moment to feel the luck of living here, today. If this journey through time has fascinated you, amused you, or maybe even lulled you toward sleep, I invite you to support this adventure. A simple thumbs up, a subscription, a comment. These small gestures make a big difference. And I have a question for you. Still here with me. Where are you listening tonight? From your bed? On your couch? In the quiet of your room? Or maybe while traveling? And at what hour do you dive into these stories? Late at night? In the middle of the day? Or just before sleep? Your answer in the comments will bring this community of nighttime listeners to life. The Middle Ages, a strange, harsh, fascinating world. A world where we wouldn't last 5 minutes. And yet, thanks to them, thanks to their survival and perseverance, we are here today. So close your eyes, let these images drift away. And if sleep comes, surrender to it. Good night, and see you soon for another whimsical bedtime story.